Hi, I'm Selena, and it is Classics Week on my channel, which means I'm going to be doing 5 videos in 7 days of only classics content. Last time I did Classics Recs for beginners. I'll link that in the cards, as well as a playlist for the whole Classics Week 2020. But today's video is going to be about my intermediate Classics Recs. So these are not the books that I recommend for beginners, but they are some maybe a little bit more unknown, or maybe a little bit of classics that you need an extra push to read. These are those kind of recs for people who've been reading classics for a while. And again, this is not going to be every intermediate book that exists for classics. If you have books on here that you think are a bit more difficult, that you're wondering where they are, you can check in my Classics I Still Need to Read video. That might answer your question. I may not have read them yet, but that doesn't stop you from leaving comments and telling everyone what you think the most intermediate or difficult level classics are, so that all of us can get more recommendations, and hopefully you can get some recommendations yourself. So starting off with fairy tales, I think fairy tales are some of the easiest to get into when you're reading classics, except for one. One in particular, while I love it, is quite hard to get into, and that is Beauty and the Beast by, I can't say her name, I'm sorry. So this is the story that inspired Beauty and the Beast, and every Beauty and the Beast retelling, every Beauty and the Beast adaptation. This is the original. There's actually several versions of the original, but I think this is maybe the first one, the oldest one. This is a French classic. This is in translation. The language is a lot older. This was written in the 1700s. It's one of the oldest classics I've read, so it's a bit harder. It's a bit more detailed. The plot structure is, this is a much longer fairy tale, which is another reason why I don't think it's a good place to start. Fairy tales that are like quick, like Grimm's, are really easy to get through, whereas Beauty and the Beast, taken together with the language and the length, can kind of trip you up a little bit. And it's also really different from the original fairy tale. There's a whole backstory that is very complex and very hard to follow, and is not in any adaptation of Beauty and the Beast that I've seen. People tend to cut that part out and not use it. But I really, really enjoyed this. I just would not recommend it for a beginner to classics, but if you like fairy tales, this is definitely a must read. Moving on to fantastical type classics, this is a weird one because I put it on the beginners list as well, because I think it can go either way, and that one is Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. So some people start with this and love it, and it is really easy for them to get into, really easy for them to latch onto the story and just be swept away by it. For me, the language and the detail was a bit much, and I couldn't get quite swept away with it the first time I read it. I love this book, but it was a bit hard for me at first, and so I'm adding this on this list as well. If you've tried it and when you were a beginner and it didn't work for you, maybe give it a second try. I do think it can belong on either beginners or intermediate depending on the person. Then I have another realistic children's classic, and that is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is an annotated edition, so that's why it's so big, but I highly recommend this book. I loved this book, but I do think it's a bit harder to wrap your head around than Little Women or Anne of Green Gables, maybe because our protagonist is not very likable. Also, I think this book moves a bit slower, and it just has a lot more in detail, in my opinion. It just feels a bit older than the others, and I think it might be because there is some significant inspiration taken from Wuthering Heights, and so it does seem to be bridging the children's / older people reading gap a little bit. And so it is a bit more complex, in my opinion. You may disagree. You may think this is beginners. That's totally fine. I'm putting it on here. Because that's the impression I got from it. But this is about a girl named Mary who's kind of a brat, and after her parents die in India, she has to come live with her uncle in England. And her uncle is kind of grumpy and not really interested in Mary or having kids around, but he has this beautiful yet old and kind of depressing estate, which doesn't have a lot of life to it, and this is about Mary kind of developing as a person as she is finding out more about her uncle and finding out more about his house, and maybe the gardens that he used to have. Then the final children's classic, and by far the hardest children's classic that I've ever read, I have A Christmas Carol to recommend to you. If you are in more of an intermediate phase, I do not recommend this to beginners at all. Dickens' prose is very complex, very hard to get into, very detailed, just very dense. It's very dense, even in a book that is for children. This is a great book. There's just so many words that Dickens uses when he's describing things. This was definitely, the level of reading this was surprising to me. And I'd been reading classics for a while, and so I was kind of like, I can handle this, and I don't think I got nearly enough out of this book. So yeah, I don't recommend this for beginners, but I do recommend it. It is also the only Dickens book I've read. If I had read more Dickens, I'm sure he'd be on this list, because if this is any indication, his prose is really hard to get into. Speaking of people whose prose is pretty hard to get into, I'm going to recommend Jane Austen for the intermediate, because I don't know that Jane Austen is the best place to start with classics. I mean, people do it and get into it and love it, and that's fine. It's just that, I mean, I did it, but I had a lot of help. I was in a class. And so if people are discouraged with Jane Austen right away, don't feel bad. I do find her to be a more intermediate level writer. And if you're ready to dive into her, then there's not one that I can recommend to you more highly than Emma. This one, again, I would say this is probably one of the most intricate of her novels, just because the plot is pretty intricate. It's also very thick, and it can be a bit slow, as classics are. But Emma is such a cool character. She is handsome, clever, and rich, and she does not need a man to basically be self-sufficient, and she knows it, but she gets no end of delight in matchmaking other people badly. She's quite oblivious, but she's lovable as well, and this is her story of trying to matchmake everyone, and it kind of backfires on her, and it's just really fun. There's also a second plot going on along, like, the Emma doesn't realize it's happening, but you can kind of pick up on it if you read really closely, and that is really fun. And so that's why I would say this is intermediate, because if you can pick up on that plot point, it's subtle, but it's there. But it also can make a lot of this book feel a little bit pointless or dragged on, so that's why it's a more intermediate pick for Jane Austen. If you're trying to begin Jane Austen, maybe this isn't your best bet, but if you're interested in that, check out that Classics to Begin With video, because I talk about her in it and what I recommend starting with. Then I'm going to talk about two Gothic books, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. These are both Gothic literature. Frankenstein is a lot older than Picture of Dorian Gray, and it's more in Jane Austen style. While it is pretty short, it is also, the language is a lot older. Mary Shelley writes in a more involved, like, detailed, dense way, as was common for early 1800s. But I do think this book is really worth a read. It also has this literary device that was really common at the time to frame the story within a letter, within a story, like within people telling you, like, the story you won't be experiencing the story firsthand, you'll be hearing it from other people, and there might be several people in between you, the reader, and, like, the story, like, it'll be several people telling the story, and that's definitely the case with this one, and it can feel a little bit disconnected at times, and it can feel a little bit slow at times due to that, but this is a really subtle, beautiful story that is kind of creepy and just very different from what you know about Frankenstein, and I highly recommend it if that sounds interesting. Picture of Dorian Gray, I recommend this as an intermediate one because I also struggle with this language. I struggle with Frankenstein as well, but this one, like, I was not expecting to struggle with, because people say it's a good one for beginners, and I just didn't feel that way. I really wanted to enjoy the story, but Oscar Wilde has a very stylized prose, which people love. If you like stylized prose, then you might love this book, but I had struggles with it. And this one is about a man named Dorian Gray who his picture is painted, and he realizes he is really handsome, and he becomes very conceited, and his person inside starts becoming very twisted, but his portrait begins taking all that twistedness and the worst parts of him on, while his self stays the same. It's really thrilling. It was surprising for a classic. I was not expecting it to go the places it went or be as explicit about the things it was. I can definitely see why this was kind of a scandalous book back in the day. Speaking of stylized prose, there's some others that I don't recommend purely because the prose is super stylized. One of those is one of my favorites, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I don't recommend this for beginners just because it is quite dense and the prose is quite stylized, lyrical. It's like that for a reason, and this book is genius, but I don't recommend it for beginners. I do recommend it though, so if you're not new to classics, highly recommend. This is kind of a domestic thriller, classic domestic thriller, about this woman who is unnamed, who marries this widower named Maxim and goes to his estate, back to his estate with him, and quickly realizes that the whole town, the whole estate, seems to be obsessed with Maxim's late wife, Rebecca. And our narrator becomes more obsessed with Rebecca herself. And that's all I want to say. This is such a good book. Please pick it up. Continuing with the stylized prose, I would recommend Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy's writing is a lot more dense and a lot more difficult to get into for a similar reason. It's kind of lyrical and also pretty detailed. He definitely has a very specific style, and so I don't recommend him for beginners at all, but I do recommend him for a more intermediate classics reader. Tess of the D'Urbervilles has some pretty extreme trigger warnings for rape, though. I will be putting trigger warnings for more of these books in the the comments. Okay, next I think I'm going to recommend a modernist book, which is not on this list because I think the prose is necessarily hard to read. I just think the story structure is very different than what we're used to as modern readers, and that book is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is a modernist novel. It was written in the 1920s. This is a stream of consciousness novel. So what that means is you jump from a lot of characters' heads without warning. This is not a first-person novel, like you can tell who it is, it'll tell you the name of who these people are, but it's not a story that has really a huge plot. It's very focused on characters and seeing the world through each of these characters' eyes. This follows one day, several characters living out this one day. Our main two are Mrs. Dalloway, who the book is named after, who is planning a party, and she keeps being assaulted by all these memories that are coming and coming and coming and coming. We also follow Septimus Smith, who is a war veteran who is also deeply traumatized and haunted by his memories. And so this book deals a lot with memory. It deals a lot with how cognition really works. I love this book because of that. I love this book because I could relate. My brain works like this too. Like Mrs. Dalloway will see a thing and then a memory will come back to her and she'll be kind of living in it for a second, and then she'll come to, and then something else will catch her attention, and then there will be a noise that everyone on the street hears, and then it'll switch to another person who heard that same noise, and then another person will be across the street, and then we'll go to that person's head. This is a very confusing book. It can leave you breathless at times. It moves very fast from different perspectives while not having a plot. I thought it was thrilling because of how much it moved, which is odd because it doesn't have a plot. So this is not a book for everyone. I don't recommend it for everyone, but if you're interested in what I've just been telling you about it, I think you should check it out. I only put it on intermediate, not because the language is any harder. I do think the language is pretty plain. It is the different story structure. We are not used to stream of consciousness novels. We're not used to books without plot. This is definitely both of those things. The next are all kind of similar in how they're written. But first I'm actually going to go into Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. This is another one that is similar to Mrs. Dalloway in how it's written, but also harder, I would say. So if you're not a fan of Mrs. Dalloway, you're not going to be a fan of this. They're very different. Like, I'm not comparing them because I don't think they're anything alike. It's just that they both have a confusing jumpiness to themselves, to the books. Ceremony follows a traumatized war veteran who is also Native American, who I don't remember his name. I don't own the physical copy, and I haven't read this book for 3 years, but this is a really good book about this veteran trying to heal from the trauma that this world has inflicted upon him in the war and also outside of the war. He has been hurt and just devastated over and over and over and traumatized over and over and over by America and the state of the world. And this is a really beautiful story about healing, but this character's head, much like the characters in Mrs. Dalloway, the character's head doesn't think of things as linear. We will jump from different times. He will explain things in a very lyrical way, and you have to kind of read it a second time to get what he's talking about, what setting he's talking about, or what moment he is in. This book is purposely trying to confuse you, where I don't think Mrs. Dalloway is, and that's why this is definitely a harder read, I would say, but it is still worth it if you can handle it. I'm also going to have trigger warnings for probably this one and also Mrs. Dalloway in the description, or the pinned comment. Not the description. Why do I keep saying the description? You should still check the description because I have links to petitions and things in the description, but not trigger warnings. Next, I'm going to recommend two books that are both magical realism, and they both have very different sort of structures of plot. The first one I'm going to recommend is definitely more easy to get into, and that is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This book is about a Black woman named Janie who has kind of been... She's trying to figure out who she is and what she wants, and trying to clear her mind of what everything else, everyone around her wants and who everyone else around her thinks she is. She's trying to get to the root of the real her, but life has a way of making that really hard, especially when she's a woman and she's expected to marry and be kind of subservient to her husband. And so this is kind of a story of her life and of the events of her life that kind of leads her to who she is. This novel is full of nuggets of insight. Zora Neale Hurston's writing is a bit complex, and it can be kind of lyrical in a way that you have to kind of think about it a bit more to figure out what's going on. But the dialogue is all really straightforward. The complex part of the prose is not it's scattered throughout this novel, so it's not the whole novel like something like Ceremony. This book is a lot of scenes, not a lot of being in people's heads, but when you are in people's heads, it's really beautiful. So I really recommend it, but I do think that it can be a bit hard to recommend to a beginner. The next book I'm going to recommend is The Other Magical Realism. I also don't own this one, and that is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. This is a generational story about this family and the cycle of trauma and abuse that it experiences for several generations. We start with, oh man, what's his name? I don't remember his name. I read this 4 years ago, so I have no idea. But I just am blanking. I know his name, I can't think of it. Anyways, it follows this man as he marries into this family with a lot of really special women in it, and it's about the atrocities he commits against a lot of the people in his life and how that comes to haunt his family and haunt his life. This is a really moving, really difficult novel to read. I'm going to be leaving major trigger warnings in the comments for this one. Also, just major trigger warning for rape. If there's rape in a book, I'm going to tell you right here. I'm not going to wait for you to go look in the pinned comments. This one's really graphic. This is a very graphic book, but there's a lot more stuff, so definitely go check the comments. And then the final book that I'm going to recommend to you is on this list because a mix of the complexity of the prose and also the length, and that is Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. This is the only George Eliot I've read, but her prose is up there with Dickens in some of the most complex yet good prose. I guess Dickens is objectively good. I like Eliot's way better than Dickens. This is a story about the intertwining lives of two very separate characters, and there's not really much to tell you. This is a very character-driven novel, which is another reason why it's really hard to recommend to beginners, because not everyone's into this kind of slow-paced, character-focused novel without really a plot. We've got Gwendolyn, who is growing up as a woman, and this book is very honest about a woman's experience. And then we also have another character who is named Daniel Deronda, who is he feels disconnected from his past, and he is trying to find out more about that. And it's about their relationship, in whatever form of relationship that is. It's kind of up to interpretation as well. And it's about their separate lives. There's different threads of this novel. There's the Daniel thread and the Gwendolyn thread, and it's very long, very dense. George Eliot's writing, though, is stellar. She can describe things so perfectly, like so spot on. It's really good. This is definitely worth the read if you're interested, but I mean, obviously I'm not going to recommend this giant thing to a beginner. Thank you for watching this video. These are some of the books that I recommend for intermediate classics readers. Let me know what you would recommend, and let me know what your favorite classic is in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. Bye.